Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Bill Adams, and tonight I'm going to reprise my role as understudy for Tom McCann, who is indisposed again. First item is to turn off cell phones and beepers. Actually, I am going to understudy several roles tonight, so stay tuned. The chair of the nominating committee, Mrs. Elizabeth Shannon, is also unavailable tonight, so I shall read the report of the nominating committee for the Friends. For President, Dr. John LaRosa. Vice President, Mrs. Peggy Dray. Secretary-Treasurer, Mr. Sean Noel. New incoming board members, Mr. Robert Rudnick, Ms. Susan Roberts, Mrs. Beth Sulak, Mrs. Robin Mosgrove, Ms. Julia Donahue, Ms. Olga Reisman. I will now ask for a vote from the floor accepting this slate of officers and new board members. All members of the Friends in favor of this slate say aye. Aye. Those opposed, the motion is carried. Unfortunately, I have no gavel here tonight, but congratulations to the new officers and board members. The next order of business is the presentation of the awards to the winners of the Lawrence Blackman Student Book Collecting Contest. I will now ask Sean Noel, Associate Director of the Howard Gotlieb Archival Research Center, to come up and present the award to our winners.
Thank you, sir.
I'm not finished yet.
Good evening. For more than 40 years, the Friends of the Libraries at Boston University has sponsored a book collecting contest open to all students at the university. The Board of the Friends recognized that to discover the difference between a library and a collection, a student must start the acquisitive process early, and that the Friends organization itself could offer the incentives of encouragement, advice, and cash rewards. I had the honor of moderating the judging of the contest this year, and it was a gratifying experience to discover the talented and dedicated students who have developed a passion for collecting books. Tonight, our winners prevailed in a very tough competition, and we should all be proud of them, and thankful to Mr. Lawrence Blackman and the Friends of the Libraries for sponsoring this most important contest. Before announcing the winners and awarding them their prizes, I would like to acknowledge our judges. Professor Lawrence Breiner, the ad interim chair of the English department here at Boston University, whose teaching and research interests include Caribbean literature and poetry. His work in progress is Orality and Decolonization in West Indian Poetry. Professor Breiner, please stand up. And Catherine Kominas, our own Assistant Director for Rare Books at the Howard Gotlieb Archival Research Center. Catherine, please stand. Our third judge, Professor Anita Patterson, the Director of American Studies and Professor of English, was unable to be here this evening. The judges gave up many hours of their valuable time in order to read all of the entries and devoted an entire day to interviewing the semifinalists. And I can tell you all of the judges expressed how much they enjoyed the opportunity of meeting with these students. So please join me in a special thank you again to our judges. I present the Emerging Collectors Prize in the amount of $200 to John Tietze for a collection of Bertrand Russell. John is a PhD candidate in philosophy and a member of the class of 2011. I present the fourth prize in the amount of $500 to Jessica Volz for a collection of Errol LeCain. Jessica is an undergraduate in the University Professors Program working on European cultural studies and journalism and a member of the class of 2008. We've been doing this for a few years. So. I present the third prize in the amount of $750 to Lauren Kohler for a collection of Japanese yaoi manga. Lauren is an undergraduate English major and a member of the class of 2008. Lauren? I am pleased to award the second prize in the amount of $1,000 to Adam Fitzgerald for a collection entitled Visionary Poets. Adam is pursuing his Master's of Editorial Studies at Boston University's Editorial Institute and is a member of the class of 2008. And it is my honor to present both the Essay Prize for $200 for an essay entitled Color Fish Plates, Classic, Mediocre, and Contemporary, and the first prize in the amount of $1,500 to William George for a collection of North American game fish books, which was extraordinary. William is an undergraduate studying international relations and is a member of the class of 2008, which is well represented here tonight. So. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're not tired of applauding. Let us please congratulate these wonderful students with another round of applause. Thank you.
Before I introduce our special guest, I would like to take a moment to thank our outgoing president, Tom McCann. As you have heard, Tom is unable to be with us this evening. In his tenure as president, Tom has presided over many excellent events and has done so with style and class. We are all very appreciative of his work for the Friends. When we next see him, we will present Tom with this commemorative clock. The engraving reads, Thomas McCann, President, Friends of the Libraries at Boston University, 2005 to 2008. May we now have another round of applause for Tom. And now to the feature presentation. Tonight we are pleased to have the distinguished poet and classical music reviewer, Lloyd Schwartz, as our speaker and guest of honor. The multi-talented Lloyd Schwartz was born and raised in Brooklyn and received his bachelor's degree from Queens College and earned his PhD from Harvard University. He is well known in academic circles, having taught at Boston State College, Queens College, and Harvard University, and is currently the Frederick S. Troy Professor of English at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. Music lovers will know him as the classical music editor of the Boston Phoenix, and from his frequent appearances as a commentator on NPR's Fresh Air. Mr. Schwartz is perhaps best known for his work as a poet and writer. His most recent book of poetry was Cairo Traffic, published in 2000, which was preceded by Goodnight Gracie and These People. His poems, articles, and reviews have appeared in the New Yorker, The Atlantic, Vanity Fair, and the New Republic, to name a few. In 1994, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for criticism. In 1983, Mr. Schwartz edited the collection of Elizabeth Bishop and her art, and most recently, he served as co-editor of the collected works of Bishop for the Library of America, entitled Bishop Poems, Prose, and Letters, which was published this year. There will be time for questions following his talk. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Mr. Lloyd Schwartz.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Vita, Sean, Chris, thank you for facilitating this so gracefully. And I'm very happy to be here and honored to have been asked. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got here tonight. Good idea. You know the joke about someone stops a famous musician in Manhattan and says, "How do you get to Carnegie Hall?" And he says, "Practice, practice, practice." I have some, what I think are some interesting stories, and it's amazing to me, my own good fortune. There's a very interesting late story by Henry James called The Jolly Corner. And it's a story about someone who has made a decision in his life, and he meets the ghost of the person he might have been if he hadn't made that decision. And sometimes I feel that way about my own life, because my big decision was to live in Boston and to stay in Boston. I'm a New Yorker, as you've heard. I was born in Brooklyn, and I went to Queens College. I love New York. I still love New York. And when I came up here to go to graduate school across the river, I thought I would go back to New York as soon as I possibly could, as soon as I got some piece of paper that said I was through, and would go back to New York and spend the rest of my life going to the museums and the symphony and the opera and walking the streets of Manhattan. Yet when I got my first offer of a teaching job, I was still in graduate school. I had not finished my PhD. It took me quite a while to get through with that. It would have meant that I could have gone back to New York. It was at a school right near New York City. I could have lived in New York. And I turned it down because things were happening here that couldn't have happened anyplace else. One of the things was that there was an extraordinary institution, I suppose you could say. Robert Lowell at Harvard. Robert Lowell was the poet in residence. And he was probably the poet I most admired at that time. We're talking about the early 60s. and widely considered the greatest living American poet. He was teaching at Harvard. I was much too intimidated to take a course with him, but I discovered that he had what he called office hours. And Robert Lowell's office hours were about 3 hours a week, one day a week, and anyone could come. Anyone could drop in, drop out. People came off the streets. There were undergraduates, there were graduate students, sometimes famous poets who were passing through, like Elizabeth Bishop, would come and sit in on Lowell's office hours. They were great friends. And this was, for me, actually the most profound experience as a student, and especially as a poetry student, that I had in graduate school, much deeper than any individual academic course that I took. And I got to meet other poets who were very serious about poetry and who admired Robert Lowell. And meeting some of those people who became friends for life, and going through the whole process of showing each other poems and getting very astute and constructive and helpful, but absolutely honest criticism from these poets, fellow poets, I would hope, was something I never wanted to give up. And some of the people I most trust with my own drafts to give me advice and encouragement, or say, drop it, throw it away, are still around, and are people I still trust, and I think trust me to respond in a similar way. I did not want to give that up. I had another very interesting experience, because one of my secret ambitions was to be an actor. I loved the theater. I loved the theater in New York. I was a kind of child actor in local productions. I really loved the theater, and I kind of gave it up when I went to college, partly because I thought the students in the drama club were too full of themselves and not full enough of what theater was really all about and what a kind of cooperative venture it was. So I joined the literary magazine, and that sort of changed my direction. When I came to Harvard, there was a very interesting group of people putting on plays. I couldn't afford either the time or the money to go. I was living on a scholarship of $1,500 a year plus tuition, which was also $1,500 in those days. Now we pay that for a gallon of gas. But there was an extraordinary group of directors and actors who were doing theater in Cambridge. People like Tommy Lee Jones and Stockard Channing. James Woods was a student at MIT who was involved in theater. John Lithgow, really amazing people. And I, in order to get free tickets to those plays, I wrote reviews for some of the Harvard houses had their own drama reviews, which was really my first opportunity to write reviews. And I found it was a very interesting and illuminating thing to do. I learned a lot. And when I passed my PhD orals, a friend of mine dared me to audition for this company of extraordinary actors and directors, and I got a part. and continued to act increasingly in theater around here with those very people whom I admired so much. And that was another reason that I didn't want to leave Boston, because how could I do that if I lived any place other than here? I did have to give that up because I got a teaching job at Boston State College. They had just opened evening sessions, and the job I was offered meant I would have to teach in the evening. And that meant I couldn't really do theater. I couldn't do live theater. But I did do some radio work, and I was a regular actor on a children's show that some of you might even remember, called The Spider's Web. It was on WGBH, and it was a program in which complete books were read, except for he said and she said. And there was usually a small cast of actors, 3 or 4 actors, reading all the parts. My best part was Scrooge in Christmas Carol, and it's still one of the best parts I've ever had. And 2 other actors, a woman and a man, did all of the other characters. So it was kind of an amazing thing. I had loved music from my childhood. My mother had records in the house, and including some classical records. We had an old wind-up Victrola that I grew up with. I still have it in my living room. So I was passionate about music, and when I was an undergraduate, I took as many music courses as I could, as long as it didn't interfere with my being an English major. Queens College had a very, very good music department. So I knew something about music, but I didn't have a very deep education, and I actually played the violin. People often ask me if I play a musical instrument. And I played the violin for a year when I was 5 years old, but my father had an accident and was out of work for a while, and we couldn't afford music lessons. There were nothing like free music lessons in the public schools in those days. Maybe there still aren't. But I never went back to it. And when I cared enough about music to wish I had learned how to play an instrument, I cared too much about it to want to hear myself play an instrument. One of my classmates in graduate school was Richard Dyer, who was also in the English department. And when he started writing for the Globe, I would go to concerts and run into him at intermissions. He was someone I loved hearing his opinion, even though I didn't always share it. And through Richard, I met some of the other music critics in Boston. Writing about music was about the farthest thing from my mind as anything I could imagine. But I loved going, and I certainly had a lot of opinions about what I heard and what I saw. And this is a kind of interesting story about about the history of newspapers in Boston. In 1975, the Boston Herald was actually attempting to compete with the Globe. And that year, thank you for the laugh, that year, the Boston Symphony was going on a European tour. And of course, they would send Richard Dyer to Europe to cover the tour and he had a whole string of a whole team of second-string critics to cover whatever events he would be missing in the 2 weeks that he was away. And the Herald decided that they were going to send its music critic, their music critic, Ellen Pfeiffer, to Europe also, but she didn't have anyone to cover any of the events that were going to be taking place in those 2 weeks in Boston. And there were two very juicy events. One was a recital by Beverly Sills. One was a recital by Arthur Rubinstein, which turned out to be his very last Boston appearance. But she thought someone needed to cover this, and she thought maybe that Lloyd Schwartz, who has so many opinions and who seems to be articulate about music in some way, maybe he could cover this. And she asked Richard if he thought I could. And he said, well, I don't know. I've never read anything he's written, but, I know he's a good student. Give him a shot. And so Ellen asked me to cover those two concerts, and I had a wonderful time. It was really exciting to do that, to play a reporter. And in those days, reviews had to be in the night of the concert, so you had at most an hour to write a review. You had to rush to the newspaper office at 10 o'clock or 10:30 at night, if it was an opera, even later, and go to an electric typewriter, this was pre-computer, and pound out a story in under an hour and tear the pages out of the typewriter and race to the city desk, city desk like in His Girl Friday, and hand the paper to the night editor. And then the next day, there would be more or less what you wrote with your name on it, and a check for $30. Well, that wasn't the next day. That was a few days later. And it was just very exciting to do that, to play reporter and to play reviewer. And when Ellen came back from Europe, she read what I wrote, and she said that she liked what I did, and how would I like to do more reviews? And I said, sure, of course. And for the next 3 years, I was the second string classical music critic for the Boston Herald, and I was covering 2 or 3 concerts a week, all at this very close deadline, overnight deadline. And I didn't think of it at the time, but it was a great apprenticeship, a trial by fire in many ways. And at the end of those 3 years, the Herald collapsed again, and all of the freelancers were, not even fired. We were just ignored. And that was the end of my career as a classical music critic. But it just so happened that the Phoenix classical music critic was going to be away, and they were looking for someone, and I sent them my clips, and I know they were looking at 2 other people, and one of them was a fashion critic, and for some reason I got the job, and I've been writing for the Phoenix ever since then, and what a joy that was, and what a joy that still remains, because suddenly I had practically all the space I needed. I had nearly a week to write a review or a series of reviews and to put them together into some kind of essay. I was an English major after all, and how the shape of a piece was very important to me, and I had a wonderful editor in those days. I still have a very good editor, but I learned a lot about putting a piece together, about how to write a piece, a long piece that had real substance to it. And I found that there was a kind of interesting connection between my poetry, which I was still extremely serious about, and my reviews, because my poems, and this had something to do with my theater background, I think. My poems really were more about character and the way characters, both real and imaginary, spoke using a kind of natural language, maybe heightened a little bit, not sloppy, but I hope, but keeping to a kind of natural voice in my poems. So my poems were not really very lyrical or poetic, but I found that writing reviews, that all the kinds of metaphors and figurative language that you usually expect to find in a poem, which really weren't in my poems, got into my reviews, and that interest in poetry and my own passion about poetry and reading poetry, loving poetry and wanting to write it, actually served me very well and as a critic. In a way, I didn't know enough about music, about the technical side of music, to write about it from a technical point of view. And I was always very bored by, I loved reading about music, but I was always bored by reviews that emphasized technique over content. I was interested in the emotional and intellectual and dramatic elements of music. I still am. I know more about music, about the technical side of music now than I did when I started writing about music over 30 years ago. I've had some very nice awards, and I am especially grateful for those awards because it means that some people, some professionals, actually find what I have to say valuable, even though I'm not the sort of usual critic who emphasizes the technical side of music. So I'm very grateful for that. When I have my own doubts, I think, well, but someone thinks I'm okay. Let me go back to poetry for a moment, for a few moments. One of the things that happened at Harvard that would not have happened if I had gone to New York after graduate school was that I met Elizabeth Bishop. And Elizabeth Bishop came to Harvard to replace Robert Lowell. They were very dear friends. He was leaving the country and going to live in England, and he had recommended that his friend Elizabeth Bishop take over for him as the poet in residence at Harvard. She had been living in Brazil for nearly 20 years. That's a fascinating story about how that happened, but I think I'm not going to go into that right now. I had loved her work. I had a great teacher when I was at Queens College who always used to have students. She lived in Greenwich Village, Students would follow her home on the subway, Mary Doyle Curran, follow her to her apartment in Greenwich Village. And she had a little studio apartment. She sat in a big easy chair. We sat on the floor, and she would read us contemporary poetry. Robert Lowell and Richard Wilbur and James Wright and Elizabeth Bishop. And my first experience of the first time I ever heard of Elizabeth Bishop was listening to Mary Curran read a poem. And I would actually like to read that poem tonight. I think it's still one of her really great poems. And it's a fascinating poem. It's a poem that was in her first book. It's a poem that's called The Man Moth. And she got the idea for this poem, she said, because there was a newspaper misprint for the word mammoth. And it was M-A-N-M-O-T-H. And she saw this word and invented a kind of creature called the man moth. And I think this creature that she invented is her kind of fantasy image of what being a poet was like, what it meant to her to be a poet. So I'd like to read you The Man Moth. Here above, cracks in the building are filled with battered moonlight. The whole shadow of man is only as big as his hat. It lies at his feet like a circle for a doll to stand on, and he makes an inverted pin, the point magnetized to the moon. He does not see the moon. He observes only her vast properties, feeling the queer light on his hands, neither warm nor cold, of a temperature impossible to record in thermometers. But when the man moth pays his rare, although occasional, visits to the surface, the moon looks rather different to him. He emerges from an opening under the edge of one of the sidewalks and nervously begins to scale the faces of the buildings. He thinks the moon is a small hole at the top of the sky, proving the sky quite useless for protection. He trembles, but must investigate as high as he can climb. Up the facades, his shadow dragging like a photographer's cloth behind him. He climbs fearfully, thinking that this time he will manage to push his small head through that round, clear opening and be forced through as from a tube in black scrolls on the light. Man, standing below him, has no such illusions. But what the man moth fears most, he must do, although he fails, of course, and falls back, scared, but quite unhurt. Then he returns to the pale subways of cement he calls his home. He flits, he flutters, and cannot get aboard the silent trains fast enough to suit him. The doors close swiftly. The man moth always seats himself facing the wrong way. And the train starts at once at its full, terrible speed, without a shift in gears or gradation of any sort. He cannot tell the rate at which he travels backwards. Each night, he must be carried through artificial tunnels and dream recurrent dreams. Just as the ties recur beneath his train, these underlie his rushing brain. He does not dare to look out the window, for the third rail, the unbroken draft of poison, runs there beside him. He regards it as a disease he has inherited the susceptibility to. He has to keep his hands in his pockets, as others must wear mufflers. If you catch him, hold up a flashlight to his eye. Its all dark pupil, an entire night itself, whose haired horizon tightens as he stares back and closes up the eye. Then from the lids, one tear, his only possession, like the bee's sting, slips. Slyly, he palms it, and if you're not paying attention, he'll swallow it. However, if you watch, he'll hand it over, cool as from underground springs and pure enough to drink. I got to know Elizabeth Bishop when she came to Harvard. It was a great thrill to meet her, to actually tell her that I loved her poetry, which she was so shy and self-conscious about that she couldn't, she almost couldn't bear to accept praise. I can report now our entire first conversation. I went to a reading that she gave, her first reading when she came to Harvard, and I came up afterwards and said, "Oh, Miss Bishop, I loved your reading, and I've always loved your work." And she said, "Thank you." That was it. And then turned away. And then it took several years for me to get to know her. And we became great friends, and she really kind of saved my life. I had been working on a dissertation stuck with an advisor I didn't want, but I was assigned to work with, and the advisor was, I felt, very unsympathetic to what I wanted to do, and I was very unsympathetic to what he wanted me to do. And we went round in circles for 6 or 7 years, and I had pretty much given up on the idea of getting a PhD or finishing a dissertation. And someone was editing an issue of Plowshares magazine and asked me if I would be willing to write an essay about Elizabeth Bishop. And I thought, no, I didn't really feel like doing that. And I politely declined. But the idea kept turning and turning in my head about writing about Elizabeth Bishop. And I thought, well, someone really should write a book about Elizabeth Bishop because there really isn't enough material. And book, dissertation. Maybe if I thought of writing a dissertation as if it were a kind of book about Elizabeth Bishop, maybe I could actually do that. And I would have to ask her if she would mind that I did this and in some way invaded her privacy, which I know she cherished. And I fully expected that she would say no when I raised the issue of my possibly writing a dissertation about her. But I had underestimated her maternal instincts, and she felt anything she could do, I know she felt this, anything she could do to help a young scholar, a young academic, get his degree at last, she would do, and she actually offered to meet with me regularly, and she would be willing to do what she was not willing to do for anyone else, which was to actually talk about her poems. And I did this for about a year, And I wrote my dissertation, and it passed. And she read it. She was in the hospital. She was hospitalized with asthma when I finished it, and she said it cheered her up. And she gave me her reading copy of her very first book with a little poem, little verse inscribed to me. And I got my PhD, and we never talked about her poems again. So when the opportunity arose to do the first professional thing that I wrote, that I was involved with about Elizabeth Bishop, was a collection of essays about her, the book called Elizabeth Bishop and Her Art. And then 7 years ago, Robert Giroux, one of the publishers of Farrar, Straus and Giroux, was asked by the Library of America he was Bishop's publisher, and he was asked by the Library of America to edit her collected works for the Library of America. And Mr. Giroux asked me to be his co-editor. He was already in his very late 80s and was really not up to doing a lot of the work. So essentially, I took over the project and spent the last 7 years working on this, collecting all of the poems she published and a number of poems that she didn't publish in her lifetime, and a tremendous amount of prose which has been almost unknown for 60 or 70 years, out of print, never collected in a book before, and put that together with a large selection of her letters. She's one of the best letter writers who ever lived, and those are all in here. So I owe her a great deal, and I wouldn't have been taken on by UMass Boston when Boston State College closed down if I hadn't had a PhD. I didn't know that at the time, but it was a very lucky thing to do, and I probably would have never even met her if I had gone to New York to take that first teaching job. Do we have a few minutes? Because I would also like to read some of my own poems, if I may, and then I will be happy to attempt to answer any questions that you might have for me. So, if I may, I will read. I'll read a couple of my 2 or 3 poems, and this poem, which is a relatively recent poem, and not in something that I've written since my last book was published, is another poem that I owe to Elizabeth Bishop, though in a very indirect way, because after she died, I was invited by the State Department to go to Brazil and give a series of lectures about Elizabeth Bishop, because she was beginning to be recognized in Brazil as an important American writer, after her death, of course. And this is a poem that was inspired by my traveling around Brazil, one-night stands in many, many cities around Brazil. It's a poem that was published in The Atlantic a few years ago, and it's called Small Airport in Brazil. 9:31 in the departure lounge, nearly deserted. Monday night, everyone here is a little too tired to be traveling to another city. I search for an interesting face behind the newspapers and light on a young man maybe 31, slim and well-dressed, that is, dressed with some thought. His tan jacket and pressed gray pants in muted harmony with a pale yellow shirt open at the collar. No tie, though there may have been one earlier. They fit him elegantly, suit him, his thin, sandy hair and pale, fair skin. His rimless glasses suggest seriousness, not fashion, a tone confirmed by the forward gaze behind them, through them. He wears a touchingly simple gold band on his finger, another example of natural elegance. His wife must share his taste. Is he on his way to her? Is she picking him up at another small airport? Will they embrace warmly, gracefully when he arrives? Or will she be up waiting for him at home, dinner on the table? Or not, already asleep when he finally gets in after her own long day? Or is he on his way to yet another hotel after a week of hotels, tired of hotels, while his attractive, witty, attentive wife with her eloquent cheekbones and slightly sunken cheeks begins to show her own weariness of spending so many nights alone? They'll cost something, these nights. Everything costs something when you have to make your way through the world, even if you're not new to the idea or just beginning not to be new to it. And I think I will close with the first poem in Cairo Traffic. A true poem. I'm working on a poem that's so true, I can't show it to anyone. I could never show it to anyone, because it says exactly what I think, and what I think scares me. Sometimes it pleases me. Usually it brings misery. And this poem says exactly what I think. What I think of myself, what I think of my friends, what I think about my lover. Exactly. Parts of it might please them. Some of it might scare them. Some of it might bring misery. And I don't want to hurt them. I don't want to hurt them. I don't want to hurt anybody. I want everyone to love me. Still, I keep working on it. Why? Why do I keep working on it? Nobody will ever see it. Nobody will ever see it. I keep working on it even though I can never show it to anybody. I keep working on it even though someone might get hurt. Thank you. Thanks so much. Question?
Might have influenced or colored her poetry.
I'm sorry.
How do you feel her Brazilian experience might have influenced or colored her poetry?
Well, very interesting question, and in several ways, in some very concrete ways, because she started to write a lot of poems about Brazil, and her third book is called Questions of Travel, and half that book consists of poems that she wrote about Brazil, and then she continued to write poems about Brazil after that book. So it gave her a kind of subject matter. And I think it just, for one thing, it opened her eyes to conditions of incredible poverty. She lived very comfortably in Brazil, but she was certainly aware of the terrible poverty in Brazil, and she wrote brilliantly about that. Several other things happened to her in Brazil besides that. One is that possibly even her distance from North America allowed her to deal with some of the traumatic events of her childhood. Her father died when she was 9 months old. Her mother had a series of nervous breakdowns, and by the time Elizabeth Bishop was 5 years old, her mother was institutionalized for life, and Elizabeth was never allowed to see her again, though she lived another 18 years, her mother. And when she tried very hard to write about some of these things when she was living in the United States and couldn't, and somehow she was able to do that when she lived in Brazil. So it kind of liberated her. And I think that was a very, very important influence. And some of her very greatest poems are about Brazil. Yes?
Brazil, and also, did she ever write any of them in Spanish?
In Portuguese.
Portuguese, did she?
Yes, the question was what took her to Brazil, which I will answer because it's a very interesting story. She was a kind of world traveler, and she, partly because she was so uprooted when she was a child, she was really used to living in a lot of different places, and she went to Walnut Hill School here outside of Boston, and Vassar College, and when she graduated from college, she started traveling. She mainly went to Europe. But one of the things she wanted to do, she'd had this dream of sailing around Cape Horn, the southern tip of South America. And she booked passage on a Norwegian freighter, and she was going to do it. The boat was docked outside of Sao Paulo in Brazil, and there was a layover of several weeks before the boat was going to continue around the southern tip of South America. And when she was in Brazil, she had several acquaintances, not really close friends, but several acquaintances who were living in Rio. So she went to visit them. And while she was in Rio, she ate a piece of cashew fruit. And it's the fruit that the cashew nuts are, it's the same, they come from the same tree, but it wasn't cashews, but cashew fruit. And it's a rather odd tasting, kind of pungent fruit, and which of course she had never tasted before, and she had a violent allergic reaction to the cashew fruit and had to be hospitalized. And she was in the hospital for several weeks and missed the boat. But in the meantime, she fell in love with one of her acquaintances. And so she ended up staying in Brazil for almost 20 years. And that was the story about why Brazil. She did learn Portuguese, and she wrote letters in Portuguese. Here is a very frustrating story. As far as anyone knows, she wrote only one poem in Portuguese, and it was a comic poem about that she actually wrote when she returned to the United States, and it was a poem about mixers at Harvard that she was sending to a friend of hers in Brazil. That poem is supposed to be part of the Bishop archives in the Vassar College Library, and I wanted to include it in this book because it is the only example of a poem by Elizabeth Bishop in Portuguese. The only thing they could find in the Vassar Library was someone's English, not hers, someone's English translation of that poem. The original poem has disappeared. It is cataloged, it's in the library's records, but the poem itself, no one knows where it is. I hope it's not a major poem, but it's charming. The translation is awful, but I bet it's better in Portuguese. The other thing that she did when she was in Brazil is she started to translate a number of Brazilian poets and prose writers. And many of the really great Brazilian poets whom we are now aware of in this country, we were introduced to them through her translations. They're wonderful translations. And she edited a book called the 20th Century Anthology of Brazilian Poetry for Wesleyan. It's still in print, I believe, but you don't have to look it up because all of her translations are in here, and they're really wonderful translations. And she knew the greatest Brazilian poets. She was, one of her translations was a little sonnet called the Sonnet of Intimacy by a poet and playwright, and the sort of cross between the Brazilian Cary Grant and the Brazilian Bob Dylan. He was a songwriter, an actor, series of wives, many, many wives and girlfriends. And she adored him, Vinicius De Mirage. He's best known in this country for writing the screenplay, or the play that the screenplay for Black Orpheus was based on, and for writing the original Portuguese lyrics to The Girl from Ipanema. And this little sonnet is a sonnet about living out in the country and kind of palling around with the cows and chickens. And Bishop was very proud of the fact that when the New Yorker published her translation of that sonnet, it was the first time in the history of the New Yorker that the New Yorker published a poem with a four-letter word. The word was piss. It's the last word of the poem. And she was thrilled that she broke this barrier of censorship. Do we have time for some? Yes. Congratulations, by the way.
I have to ask now, though, did she ever, in fact, make her trip around Cape Horn?
No. No, she never did. She never did. She stayed in Brazil, and then she moved back and forth between Brazil and the United States, and she traveled to Europe. She went to the Galapagos Islands, but from here, not from there. No. I think she always regretted that she never, well, she didn't regret it too much. Yes?
Public and private colleges.
Yes.
What was your experience like teaching poetry to students in those colleges?
Well, I love teaching in the public institutions. They're the best student poets, and they're the best readers of poetry. There were brilliant students at Harvard. I had students, 2Ts mainly, honors 2Ts, who were much smarter than I was. But I also found there were a lot of students who felt very privileged to be there and who got by without very much effort. And they were much harder to teach than my extraordinary students at UMass Boston, who really who are, putting their lives on the line to get through school. And that was the kind of education that I had as a student at Queens College. In those days, the New York City colleges were free to residents of New York City who were, who had grades that were good enough to get in. My college education cost me $80, $10 in a $10 fee every semester plus books. Yes. Thank you very much.